Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Reagan King and joined as always by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett. This evening we are going to be discussing the unprecedented assault by Iran on Israel and its own sovereignty and the miraculous hand of God in defending the land of Israel on this particular occasion. Once allies prior to the revolution, this marks the very first time that Iran has actively itself responded in a particular way to Israel with missile strikes. And what we saw was 300 plus, 350 plus, some of the figures have varied, drones, ballistic missiles fired against Israel with incredible intervention. We can see certainly the hand of God involved in this. We see the Iron Dome was at full capacity in terms of how it was functioning. We also had the Sling of David and the Arrow, which were involved in defending Israel's skies. Some truly powerful scenes, and what we're going to be looking at this evening is whether or not this attack could launch things into a full-on regional war. Evening, Simon.
Hey, good evening, Reagan. Good to see you.
Good to be here. What is your take on the events of last weekend? First response.
I mean, what was extraordinary, I think, about Saturday night is that all of Saturday we were getting this warning that the Israelis received a few days before, and the Americans were very public about it, that Israel was facing an imminent Iranian attack. So it was a waiting game. And then, of course, when the news broke on Saturday, the 13th of April, that the Iranians had fired, initially it felt like they were firing something like 100 drones at Israel, was then later followed up by cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, as well as other kind of rockets as well. And we could actually watch this as it happened over Israel, which was extraordinary. And it kind of takes me back when I was 15 during the Gulf War, and remembering Saddam Scud's missiles that came over and attacked Israel. They landed in Tel Aviv, and there was great fear then the Israelis would respond and retaliate and break up the coalition. And I haven't seen anything like that since then. The Israelis back then had to wear gas masks because they feared that they could face a chemical or attack. But this is the first time that the Iranian regime has actually fired rockets, missiles, drones, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles from its own territory. And to say that this wasn't much of an attack, I think denies the full impact of those rockets and missiles and drones had they hit their targets. Yeah, we would be talking now about the deaths of thousands of people, huge amounts of destruction and devastation, and was essentially a direct declaration of war by the Iranian regime. And yet now Israel's told to not retaliate against this Iranian aggression. But this is the first time they haven't deployed their proxies and actually fired rockets over Israeli territory themselves. So, I mean, what must it have been like? And I've been in contact with my Israeli friends over the weekend, and they were getting ready to go into the bomb shelters and everything else. So again, another kind of historic moment in the history of Israel and the history of the Middle East, where we see God's divine hand of protection over his nation, with 99% of those rockets and drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles intercepted, which is absolutely astonishing feat.
There was some report that 50% of Iran's intended missiles and drones that they intended to send off failed to launch and didn't even make it out of Iranian airspace. So 99% of those that did, as you said, were shot down, but massive failure by the Iranian regime really in executing its plan. Of course, we saw what we could say was horrifying success on the 7th of October via its proxy Hamas, but that has come back on it. It's not by any means succeeded. This is seen to lead to the mass response in Gaza, which could very well destroy Hamas. And indeed, if Israel, so long as it sticks to its original strategy and plan, barring the total release of hostages, if indeed any are remaining alive, there is going to be no stopping of that conflict until Hamas is completely overthrown.
Yeah, but we also know that the mastermind behind October 7th was the Iranian regime, and for some reason they decided not to deploy their usual terror proxies, even though we know that rockets and missiles were fired from Yemen, which is under the control of the Houthis, as well as Iraq, and also from Iranian territory as well. And of course, all this was screened live on our television news networks as it happened. The IDF Home Command advised Israelis not to gather in large groups and to be prepared to go to bomb shelters in preparation for the Iranian missile attack. The Iranian regime warned Israel that they would respond to the Israeli airstrike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus that killed a senior Iranian general belonging to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps and 5 other Iranian soldiers. But this was the first time that Iran in its history has directly attacked Israel from its own soil instead of deploying its terrorist proxies to do their dirty work, such as Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and of course also the Houthis. And also we see, for example, that the Iranian missile attack was very similar to that of what we saw in 1991 with the first Gulf War. But the question is, what an incredible hand of deliverance. I mean, even, for example, with the best of the Israeli technology, including Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, with the incredible skillful pilots of the Israeli Air Force, combined with CENTCOM, the American Air Force, together with the RAF, the Jordanian Air Force, French Air Force, to actually intercede these drones and rockets and missiles, to actually say that 99% of those actually failed to hit their targets out of 350 missiles. It's quite astonishing. And you have to really thank the Lord for his deliverance of Israel and the Jewish people in that time, also using the latest technology and the help of Israel's international friends as well.
Absolutely, Simon. What we were seeing in some of the actions that were undertaken over the weekend was the fear that the amount of drones and the amount of missiles could potentially overpower Israel's very good defense system. Certainly when it comes to drones, they are less predictable to some degree, and more challenging. That can pose a greater challenge depending on how they're operated. But not a single drone even entered Israeli airspace. They were all shot down before they even entered Israeli airspace, which is truly incredible.
And I don't know if you've seen, we haven't got it here, but I don't know if you've seen one of those cruise missiles that actually landed in the Dead Sea. The size of this as well. And because the fact that Israel's been so successful in actually intercepting these rockets and missiles, it's being downplayed, the seriousness of what the Iranian regime did back on Saturday the 13th of April by sending these 350 projectiles to attack Israel. But also you see really, I think beginning to see that the Iranian regime is very close to developing nuclear weapons. And the danger is now that they've overstepped their mark now, as we see that their usual way of operating is to use proxy terrorist organizations, is to lie and deceive. And now really for the first time, it's out in the open. We see what a malign, evil terrorist state the Iranian regime is in actually wanting to carry out such an attack as it did against Israel last weekend. And you also see, for example, that Hamas looks like it will be destroyed in Gaza, and it could be the Iranian regime is also on its last legs, that the actors are being drawn in to a conflict with Israel where they face kind of retribution.
The Israeli President Isaac Herzog told Sky News that the Iranian missile and drone attack on Israel was a declaration of war, and it was about time the world faces this empire of evil in Tehran. And the Israeli War Cabinet has approved of retaliatory strikes by Israel against Iran and will this lead essentially to a regional war in the Middle East, and Israel potentially could it even lead to a global war is perhaps another question that walks hand in hand with that. And then we also have to ask, are we witnessing the Lord bring divine retribution down upon the enemies of Israel through this? Now, the Sun newspaper, under the headline, Israel vows offensive and defensive action as President brands Iran's 350 missile airstrike a declaration of war, sees the report that global tensions have reached a boiling point after the Israeli President Isaac Herzog declared, as we just read, this declaration of war by Iran. Booming explosions were heard in the skies above Jerusalem late on Saturday night as the chilling wail of air sirens rang out and terrified residents ran to find cover. And this is also rare, Simon, because so often Jerusalem it's not really in the line of fire. Jerusalem very often does not see this sort of scene of rockets fired right above it.
It was in October the 7th, and also we know that Jerusalem came under heavy fire during Hamas's rocket attack back in 2021.
Yeah.
So it's not immune, but it's unusual to see that. And of course, it's incredibly dramatic images of seeing the Dome of the Rock and seeing then the Iranian drones flying overhead or rockets being intercepted above the skies of Jerusalem, which is incredibly dramatic scenes as well.
And what we've seen also, and some highlighted kind of the irony of this, Israel protecting the Jordanian-controlled Dome of the Rock, Jordan defending Israel from drone attacks, as well as other Arab states expressing condemnation of Iran's
because Iran breached their airspace.
Yeah.
You know, their airspace and their integrity was breached by this Iranian attack. The Saudis also were involved in taking out many of the rockets, missiles and drones, together with the Jordanians as well. But surprise, surprise, the Palestinian Authority has remained quiet on this one, even though the likelihood it would have killed many Palestinians in the conflict had those rockets, drones, missiles and cruise missiles been actually effective. We would have seen a lot of Palestinian Arab casualties as well. So I think that's something we need to bear in mind in all of this. But it's essentially, really, we're saying that Israel is being blamed for this yet again because of the alleged Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. For the retaliatory strikes on Israel. So to exactly explain what this is, the Jerusalem Center of Public Affairs has done a very good job in which they titled their article, "The PLO-PA Iranian Terror Alliance." And this is what they say. Israel responded with crushing force, not only in Gaza, but also against the resurgent Palestinian terrorists in Judea and Samaria. Iran responded by activating its proxies in Lebanon, namely Hezbollah, and Yemen, the Houthis, attacking Israel from the north and the south.
The fighting raged on different fronts. In March 2024, the IDF intercepted yet another substantial Iranian weapons cache destined for the Fatah, i.e. that's the PLO-PA terrorists in Judea and Samaria. Officials affiliated with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps linked to the Quds force in Syria were the masterminds of the operation.
And shortly after Israel targeted and killed the IRGC Quds Force commander, Mohammad Reza Zahadi, who was reportedly responsible for the unit's operations in Syria and Lebanon, glorifying their dead commander, a mouthpiece for the Iranian regime, added that Zahadi had been involved in the planning and the execution of the October the 7th massacre.
In response to the assassination on the evening of April 13th, Iran launched an unprecedented attack, firing 185 drones, 36 cruise missiles, and 110 surface-to-surface missiles at Israel.
And we have a latest news report from our friends at CBN that looks back at the incredible events that occurred last weekend, where the Iranian regime, for the first time in its history, launched rockets and missiles from its own territory into Israel.
In its first direct strike by Iran against Israel, Iran attacked with more than 300 drones, cruise and ballistic missiles. It brought a 45-year shadow war into the light. The difference between Iran and Israel's capabilities on stark display, with reports that about half of the projectiles either failed on launch or crashed before reaching their targets. The vast majority of the rest were destroyed by Israel and its partners, including the U.S., France, Britain, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. The 99% interception rate described as a spectacular military achievement. Stunning video showed some missiles being shot down over Jerusalem. On Sunday, Israel's war cabinet met to decide how to respond. Benny Gantz said Israel will respond when the time is right, and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant urged an international coalition against Iran. After the attack, President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talked by phone. Biden reportedly told Netanyahu, "You gotta win, take a win," and urged him to carefully think through the consequences of any retaliation. He also said the U.S. won't participate in any strike against Iran.
The president's been very clear. We don't seek a war with Iran. We're not looking for escalation here. We will continue to help Israel defend itself.
Yet some U.S. lawmakers say the U.S. should support an Israeli retaliatory strike.
I think a proportionate response here. I think one option would be to take out the facilities where these drones and rockets came from and also destroy the manufacturing facilities that build the drones and rockets.
We need to stand with Israel. Israel's not at war with Hamas or Hezbollah or Yemen. Those are all surrogates for Iran. They're prostitutes. The pimp is Iran. Israel is at war with Iran. Iran hates Americans. Iran hates Jews. Iran wants to kill Americans and Jews.
Former Israeli ambassador to the UN and Knesset member Danny Danon told CBN News he believes a great defense is not enough.
We have to show also our offensive capabilities in order to create deterrence in the region against Iran. They attacked a sovereign country with 300 rockets, missiles, and UAVs, and we cannot sit idly by. And my position is that we have to hit them hard to teach them a lesson that they will not do it again.
While the Israelis and their partners praise the air defense, some also point to the power of prayer in protecting the Jewish state.
No, I want to thank all those who pray for us and stand with us. I think last night what we saw was the hand of God protecting Israel as well.
CBN's Chuck Holton shared how he hosted a live report on YouTube in the minutes after the attack started.
As the rockets and drones were still flying toward Israel, so before we knew what would actually take place, we had 40,000 people online, I believe, and we prayed altogether, 40,000 people. That's a stadium's worth of people. As we've prayed that God would thwart the plans of evil men, he came through last night and he answered our prayer. And that's a very significant thing that I think we can't forget.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Very thankful to our friends at CBN for their efficient reporting as always. There's an amazing story here. It's important to hear some firsthand witness accounts. This is in the Sun newspaper. I was in Jerusalem Hotel when Iran launched its attack. The alerts came through on our phones after we arrived back at the hotel in central Jerusalem. Like many others, we headed to our room, knowing that Iran had just launched hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles in our direction. Then at 2 a.m., we heard two enormous booms, followed soon after by emergency sirens. Every Israeli knows the drill, but for my wife Jess and I, it was the first time we'd experienced anything like it. They call it terror for a reason, because it is terrifying. There's a bizarre adrenaline rush, too. You don't have time to think and you act on instinct. It's about grabbing any clothing you can and dressing as you quickly move to the safety of a shelter. We headed below ground to level -4 and remained there as the sirens continued to blare all around us. After what felt like a lifetime but was probably only 20 minutes, we were given the all clear to return to our rooms. Our hearts were racing as the footage of what was happening overhead exploded over X and the TV news channels. We huddled together, glued to the latest developments. By the time it was all over, the Israel Defense Forces managed to intercept 99% of the drones and surface-to-surface missiles. A combination of the Arrow aerial defense system, the Iron Dome, Israeli aircraft, and warplanes from the UK and US had saved countless lives, ours included.
It's good to get that personal account. I mean, I struggled sleeping that night knowing what potentially could have happened to Israel that night, but to actually be there in Jerusalem and being in a hotel and not used to the drills there for when the rockets and missiles going off, I can imagine that's a scary experience. Yeah, I was very concerned about my Israeli friends out there and people I know out there and people I love very much. It becomes very personal, and you know, to think that Israel had to survive October the 7th and now the biggest event to shake Israel in 6 months, the unprecedented Iranian missile attack on Israel, shows that the situation is increasing and the tensions are heating up and it's becoming more and more dangerous and precarious. Well, let's now turn our attention to the kind of Iranian response to their actions of the night of Saturday the 13th of April going into the early hours of Sunday the 14th of April. So the Iranians have said that reckless retaliation to last night's unprecedented aerial attack would be met with a much stronger response. The Iranian president, Raisi, raged if the Zionist regime, which is Israel, or its supporters demonstrate reckless behavior, they will receive a decisive and much stronger response. The Iranians instigated this, not the Israelis. It says, according to the Guardian news report, Tehran has warned that it will strike again with greater force if Israel or the US retaliate for an Iranian strike on Israel that used more than 300 drones and missiles on Saturday night. They went on to say that our response will be much larger than tonight's military action if Israel retaliates against Iran. The Iranian Armed Forces Chief of Staff, Major General Mohammad Bagheri, told State TV, adding that Tehran had warned Washington that any backing of Israeli retaliation would result in US bases being targeted. The Iranian officials called that regional neighbors had been informed several days before the airstrikes. Speaking to foreign ambassadors in Tehran, Iran's foreign minister said that Iran had also informed the US that its strikes on Israel would be limited and for self-defense. So how is firing over 350 rockets, missiles, drones, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, self-defense and moderate or limited? I mean, this is a declaration of war, and had they hit their military targets, civilian targets, I mean, we would literally be at war by now, and Israel would have declared war on Iran. And also, I think when the Iranian regime, we see a lot of bluff, because we know that their military technologies, like the Russians, is 20 or 30 years out of date. This is no match for Israeli military weaponry or US weaponry, and we know that if the American administration wanted to, they could turn Iran back to the Stone Age overnight. So there's, again, using fear and intimidation as their main tactics, but I think it's now time to call out the Iranian regime for what it is, a demonic force and influence in the world.
Iran's attack has been spoken of directly as a declaration of war. Now, what this is going to lead to in the coming days remains yet to be seen. But the Israeli president says, we are seeking peace. In an interview with Sky News, he said, we were attacked last night from four corners of the Middle East with proxies shooting at us, firing ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles. He would follow that up by saying it was about time that the world faces this empire of evil in Tehran. World leaders need to make it clear to the Iranian regime that its behavior is unacceptable. we should be looking lucidly at the phenomenon called Tehran and Iran. Israel has not sought war since its creation in 1948, the president insisted. We are peace seekers. We went to peace with our neighbors time and time again. Unfortunately, it all started on the 7th of October when a proxy of Iran, Hamas, led an unbelievably brutal massacre against Israeli citizens, and the rest is history. We know it, so we should put it in perspective. The question that follows is, what was the Iranian intention behind this missile attack on Israel? We see that the attack of Hamas on October the 7th has led to catastrophic consequences for its own power and its own grip in Gaza. Personally, Simon, I'm not really certain what they expected by way of response. Surely they would have known that this would have led to such a strong response and would essentially signal their doom. What do you think the Iranian intention is here?
Well, what's so interesting about this one is that the Iranians didn't actually use their terror proxies, namely Hezbollah. They could have responded by Hezbollah firing rockets and missiles into northern Israel by attacking Israel's northern city, port of Haifa, really, as we saw back in 2006. They chose not to. So there is a message that they want to send Israel to stop assassinating their generals, because it seems very clear that the Iranians were planning something big and working in coordination with Hezbollah and a coordination with bringing over more sophisticated weaponry from Syria into southern Lebanon for a potential strike on Israel. So what they are very concerned about is the fact that Israel could be going to war against Hezbollah, and if and when Israel carries out airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, the Iranians would find it very difficult to respond to that. So again, I think this is taking pressure off their jewel in their crown, which is essentially Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and really encouraging Israel to confront the Iranians head on. But we know that the Iranians are no match for the Israeli Air Force. They are no match for Israel's military might, and if they are backed up by the Americans, then the Iranians have got no hope. The Russians are currently bogged down in fighting in the Ukraine, so won't really be able to come to their assistance. The Chinese will probably want to sit on the fence and not get directly involved, which means the Iranian regime is isolated. We know the huge unpopularity of this regime in Iran, because we're seeing that Christianity is the fastest growing religion. We're seeing the widespread protests against the Iranian regime on behalf of the Iranian women over the last couple of years regarding the plight of Ami, the Iranian woman, I've forgotten her name now. So essentially we see that the Iranians are, knowing that they are so close to producing nuclear weapons, I think have overshot their hand in this one.
There's a lot of internal strife in Iran due to Mahsa Amini's murder. We can call it that, I believe, at the hand of its morality police. And we've seen in recent days just that continue. The protests have continued. Their human rights abuses internally have continued. The people of Iran are immensely dissatisfied, and yet they're still under the power grip and control of this evil regime.
But if we look back at history, this is very similar to what we saw with the Nazi regime in the Second World War with the SS. As they knew that the Allied forces were moving closer to Germany, D-Day had already happened, they had liberated France and they were pushing eastwards towards Germany, and then we saw the Soviet army pushing westwards towards Berlin. You know that the Nazi regime's days were numbered back after the summer of 1944. In the same way, I think the Iranian regime knows that they lack that international legitimacy, they lack that political legitimacy of their own people, and they know that they're in probably the last years or the last months of the Iranian regime. And so therefore they know that their determination is to develop nuclear weapons and to strike Israel before the regime collapses. And this is what we're seeing, that the Iranians are now overplaying their hands, because with an Israeli response will be quite devastating. And if Israel wants all-out war, which the Americans and the British governments are advising them not to, Israel's more than capable of taking out the Iranian regime. And that's why it's important also that Israelis listen to the Israeli Home Guard as they receive this announcement by the IDF spokesman Hagari on what to do regarding the imminent Iranian missiles that were raining over Israel on Sunday night.
Iran has launched a direct attack from Iranian soil towards the state of Israel. We are closely monitoring Iranian killer drones that are en route to Israel sent by Iran. This is a severe and dangerous escalation. Our defensive and offensive capabilities are at the highest level of readiness, ahead of this large-scale attack from Iran. Together with our partners, the Israel Defense Forces is operating at full force to defend the state of Israel and the people of Israel. This is a mission that we are determined and ready to fulfill. I will keep on updating you. Thank you.
That's courtesy of our friends at the IDF. Simon, the Daily Telegraph reports the assault itself was well telegraphed in advance and despite the large numbers of projectiles involved, was self-contained. This was not, it would seem, a nation hurling itself into all-out war, or not yet. Do you think that Tehran actually wanted to create havoc and cause damage with this strike?
Well, of course they did, because they sent 350 rockets and missiles and drones. And we've also seen, for example, with the footage we've seen in Kyiv and Ukraine, how the Russians have been deploying these Iranian drones and the devastation that's caused in Ukraine. So we know that they work. How effective they are in terms of Israel's missile defense system, clearly they're not that sophisticated. But again, you know, they could have sent over more kind of deadly weapons and missiles, and maybe even more than 350. But 350 is a lot.
Well,
that's enough. That is enough to kill thousands of people, to destroy entire neighborhoods, to destroy neighborhoods of cities, to spread fear and panic amongst the Israeli population. So very similar to what Saddam Hussein tried to do in the First World War by firing Scud missiles over to Israel. And we've also seen the devastation that so many rockets and missiles do when Hamas fired them over, or when we go back to 2006 when Hezbollah paralyzed the whole of the north of Israel with their rockets and missiles, because they see that Israel's vulnerable. But we also see how Israeli technology is keeping up to pace with these developments. But I think also the Iranian regime also wanted to show that they are the most strongest player in the region, that they are the big horse of the region. They want to show that they are the most dominant power. And also they want to send a message to the Houthis, to Hamas, to Palestinian Islamic Jihad, to Hezbollah, that they're in control. But I think the Iranian regime has been very knocked by the high-profile assassination of its generals, as well as its commanders and its operatives who belong to Hezbollah, which has dented very much Tehran's strategic terrorism capabilities against Israel. So of course they wanted to send Israel a message by saying stop targeting our generals. But how Iran, who was one of the masterminds of October the 7th, and it wouldn't happen if they hadn't given the green light, have the audacity to say that Israel should not go any further in terms of any retaliation, or they face more deadly strikes and devastation, is pretty cheap, as we know that again the Iranian regime is it's more rhetoric than it is power.
The greater danger does seem to remain via the proxy groups. Hezbollah makes Hamas look like a minnow and is thought to have more than 100,000 missiles pointed at Israel, a good proportion of which are precision guided. Iran, the Telegraph surmises, was sending a message that it will no longer allow esteemed members of its Revolutionary Guard to be assassinated without direct reprisal. So the Telegraph seems to take a slightly different approach to this and think that potentially they gave warning and that this was indicator that they were not wanting to escalate it full on, but kind of showing what they're able to do without warning. I'm not particularly convinced by their conclusion in that regard, but certainly it achieves that purpose for Iran in their own mind.
But also I think the fact is that if the Iranians hadn't announced that they were going to plan to do this, then this would have caused huge problems in the Arab world, because you're breaching the territorial integrity of Saudi Arabia, of Jordan, and in order to attack Israel. So effectively they had to warn that they were carrying out those missiles. But it was just very surreal watching Sky News or some of the news channels on Saturday evening to find out the latest developments regarding what was happening. And you could watch this in real time as those rockets and missiles and drones came over Israel, and that Israel was then bracing itself in the early hours for the imminent Iranian attack. That 99% of those projectiles were foiled, which was extraordinary.
Well, there was a real sense of anticipation throughout the night in a very negative sense, because you could time, based on the missiles that were fired, how long before impact, how long before potential impact. With the drones, it was believed to be several hours, only a couple of hours with the most basic of the missiles, but anywhere about 12 minutes in some of the more high-powered missiles that were being fired. So the capability was there, certainly, to overpower the Israeli systems. And the Iron Dome, we have to remember, is that it's not designed for long-range missile targets. It's designed actually for shorter range. And so it's perfect when dealing with missiles coming from Gaza, but apparently David's Sling and the Arrow defense system that Israel has was utilized a little bit more in relation to these, to say nothing, of course, of the IAF and Air Force involvement, of course, from the UK, the US, Jordan as well. And so really, really incredible to see how all of these fighter jets were scrambled. Well, I saw, Simon, there was one of the Jordanian princesses apparently shot down 6 drones. She's a member of their Air Force. And you're kind of seeing this, in one way, bizarre scenario where groups that have been very critical, nations that have been very critical, and increasingly so, of Israel's right response against Hamas in Gaza, have now been in a position where they realized, oh, actually, when Israel is threatened, we are threatened too. We need to come to their aid. So despite some of the misgivings and dislike of how Israel has carried out its campaign in Gaza, many of these nations have been forced to recognize, actually, Israel does need help in defending itself here, and we're going to join in.
So let's see this video news report from our friends at CBN that looks at how the threat from Hezbollah in the north of Israel, in southern Lebanon, poses a much greater threat than some of Iran's drones or ballistic missiles in a potential second front in Israel's war against terror.
Toby Abutbul knows just how fortunate he is to be still alive. February 13th at 11:08 in the morning, Abutbul was driving down Main Street in Kiryat Shimona, a city in northern Israel near Lebanon's border, when his car's dash cam captures the moment a Hezbollah missile lands a few feet away from him.
I was driving on the streets of the city, and an anti-tank missile hits right in front of me with no warning. There wasn't even a siren sound warning of an incoming missile.
He immediately stops, puts his car in park, turns on the hazard lights, jumps out and takes cover behind his car. 10 seconds later, the second missile hits, injuring a mother and her child. And then come the sirens. 3 months earlier, on November 2nd, Hezbollah launched a barrage of 12 missiles at northern Israel, 2 of the missiles hitting right next to Abu Bul's restaurant. Surveillance video shows the moment his father and 2 siblings enter the family restaurant and the missile's impact fling them to the floor, but not seriously injured.
It was scary. My little sisters and father were here with me, but we quickly got into the bunker, and we understood that there's no room for playing games. This is very serious.
5 months later, he's nervous about what's coming.
I believe Israel and Hezbollah are going to go to war.
The traffic lights here in downtown Kiryat Shimona are blinking because there's, as you can see, hardly any traffic to speak of. It's a scene that is played out pretty much all along the Israel-Lebanon border. Some 60,000 Israelis forced to evacuate from cities like this. But you know, back in 2006, when Israel and Hezbollah were last at war, the circumstances and the situations were much different. And today, Hezbollah is a much more powerful army. What is different about this conflict compared to 2006?
Hezbollah is different. Hezbollah is much stronger, much more munition, accurate missiles, and a capability of invasion.
Every day. Former IDF intelligence officer Sarit Zahavi is a leading expert on Hezbollah. She's tracked the various weapons being used by the terror group here in the north since October 8th, the day after the Hamas massacre. In addition to more than 3,000 rockets, Zahavi says for the first time Hezbollah began firing more advanced Iranian-made weapons like the Almas-1 anti-tank guided missile.
Long-flying, short range, very accurate, no alerts, no Iron Dome cannot intercept
Israel
this.
cannot protect itself from the infrared.
Only if they are launched against tanks, but they are usually launched against everything else. Everything, not just everything. Civilian, military, whatever.
In January, Hezbollah released this video reportedly showing an Alma-1 with a camera attached to its nose targeting an IDF intelligence base.
Instead of a terrorist organization, we are facing a terrorist army. Army that has around 200,000 different kind of missiles, drones, rockets, mortars, different types, can get to everywhere in Israel.
Hezbollah is also believed to have about 100,000 fighters.
Hundreds of Hezbollah terrorists took part in what they described as a military maneuver.
The so-called tip of Hezbollah's spear is the Radwan Force, an elite squad of up to 3,000 fighters focused on infiltrating Israel's northern border.
Since they participated in the civil war in Syria, their ground forces are much more professionals, much more equipped, and even, even motivated to carry out the ground invasion because, during the years, Hezbollah mobilized them that this is their mission.
IDF released video of a strike in South Lebanon that allegedly took out a senior Radwan commander. Fighter jets also struck a reported Radwan military compound.
Since Hezbollah opened the northern front against Israel, IDF attacked 4,000 targets in Lebanon. 10% of these are against the commando units of Hezbollah. This is a very impressive number.
Zahavi says a major challenge the IDF would face in a full-scale war would be trying to identify Hezbollah foot soldiers and weapons depots. As CBN discovered on a recent trip inside South Lebanon, the terror group is very adept at hiding within the civilian population.
Hezbollah, like Hamas, is entrenched in the villages using the Lebanese human shields. Everything you saw happening in Gaza with regard to hiding the munition in the hospitals and in the mosques and in the homes, it exists the same way with Hezbollah.
Israeli military has announced it's preparing to move from defense to attack regarding operations on the northern border. Experts predict war between Hezbollah and Israel is likely within the next 6 to 8 months.
I know the IDF is here. Yeah. I know that we are much more prepared than we used to be. And yet I'm worried.
Zahavi's home here in northern Israel sits less than 5 miles from Hezbollah military positions.
We are not willing to sleep next to this monster anymore. We want the threat to be dealt because what we have learned that once they have the capability to slaughter us, eventually they will use this capability. The only way to fight this is to try to eliminate or at least damage as much as possible this capability.
George Thomas, CBN News, Northern Israel.
It's a reminder there that sometimes the tragic way to peace is through war, and something has to be done in regards to this threat via this Iranian proxy, Hezbollah, and indeed there are other proxies. I don't believe we're in a situation, Simon, where appeasement is at all possible, wise, or beneficial.
Well, also, I think since October the 7th, and considering that around 80 to 100,000 Israeli communities have been evacuated to the north, are not going to go back to their homes until they have the reassurance that Hezbollah can't carry out the same October the 7th attack as Hamas did on October the 7th. So we know that this war is going to continue. But also this takes essentially, by confronting Hezbollah, this takes the ace out of the Iranian cards, because we know that the end game leads to Tehran. It leads to their nuclear ambitions and stopping their nuclear ambitions. And if Israel can take out Hezbollah in the north and free themselves from the threat posed by Hezbollah, that means that any measure to counter any Israeli or an American airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, that Tehran won't have the proxies to use like Hezbollah or Hamas to attack Israel. So effectively what we're seeing really is all of this being played out. First with the destruction of Hamas in Gaza, next stage is the destruction of Hezbollah, and maybe stage 3 will be the destruction of Iran's nuclear program if the regime doesn't collapse first. And of course the regime gave the green light for the October 7th attacks because it really essentially felt that this could hide their nuclear weapons program. But now we've seen that Israelis have taken out too many of their top IRGC generals and their terror chiefs. And so therefore they are making a stand by saying enough is enough, but also they risk a real war and a confrontation with Israel in which they'll lose, not only militarily, but also they know that they're coming against the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
The Iranian regime has demonstrated just how militarily weak it is in its failed attack on Israel. Writing for The Telegraph, its Defense and Foreign Affairs editor, Con Coughlin, says, thus far from fulfilling the pledge made by Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah al-Khamenei at the end of Ramadan last week that Israel must be punished, all the drone and missile bombardment has achieved is to expose the fundamental weakness of Iran's military threat. More than that, the Iranians have demonstrated to the rest of the world their true status as a hostile state that not only sponsors a global network of Islamist terror groups, but is intent on waging war against the West and its allies. Until now, Iran has successfully managed to cover its tracks by avoiding a direct confrontation with Israel, preferring instead to rely on a deadly network of terror groups such as Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to do its dirty work. This has enabled Iran to maintain a cloak of deniability about its true intentions, one that has persuaded naive leaders in the West to engage with the Iranians in the belief that compromise was possible. It was this mindset that persuaded former President Barack Obama, with the tacit support of David Cameron's government, to negotiate the flawed nuclear deal with Iran in 2015, which made no meaningful provision for curbing Tehran's terrorist activities. Now the mask has slipped, and Iran's attack on Israel has revealed the Islamic Republic's true intent for all to see. A watershed moment that is likely to have a profound impact on how the world's major democracies view the Ayatollahs in future. Iran will no longer be regarded merely as a challenge for Western policymakers, but as a tangible threat to Western security that must be tackled head-on, whether it concerns thwarting its efforts to acquire nuclear weapons or dismantling its terrorist infrastructure, both in the Middle East and the wider world. Tehran is, after all, a central player in the developing alliance of autocratic regimes, which includes Russia, China, and North Korea, that is inimical to the values of Western democracy. By finally finding the courage to attack Israel directly, Iran's bluff has finally been called to the extent that rather than constantly giving Tehran the benefit of the doubt, Western leaders should accept that they are now at war with Iran and act accordingly.
And of course we are at war with Iran. We have been for ever since the Iranian regime came to power with the Islamic Revolution back in 1979, but it's taken a long time for Western leaders to realize that. And we see that under this title, the danger of the US and its European allies in wanting to escalate tensions. Jonathan Tobin, who's the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, writes under the headline, "America calls for Israel restraint won't make either nation safe." Biden's efforts to prevent a strike on Iran are like his demands intended to save Hamas from defeat, rooted in US policy, not US interests. He goes on to say, in view of the Biden's administration's restraint, like virtue, is its own reward. Having helped Israel fend off an unprecedented Iranian missile and drone attack on Saturday night, President Joe Biden reportedly told the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he should consider the successful indignation of almost every one of the projectiles hurled at the Jewish state to be enough of a victory to satisfy his country, and made it clear that Israel should refrain from ordering retaliatory strike on the Islamist regime. Those calls were echoed by America's European allies and others in the region. The notion that Israeli security is best served by doing nothing or as little as possible, always Washington's advice whenever Israel is attacked, is not reasonable, as both Biden's apologists and Netanyahu's critics seem to think. He goes on to say, more importantly, the assumption that needs to be rethought is that the most serious issue facing Israel and the United States in the Middle East right now is the danger escalating the conflict with Iran. It is not that Israel has been too aggressive in seeking to force Iran to scale back its support for the terrorist allies and its auxiliaries. It's the years of Biden's administration appeasement of Iran that have led that rogue regime to believe that it can act with relative impunity, requiring Israel to stand down merely grants an unearned and dangerous victory to Tehran.
Biden's weakness and the clear evidence of the growing distance between Israel and the United States encouraged Iran and its allies to believe that attacks on the Jewish state, whether Hamas's cross-border attacks on October the 7th or the weekend missile launches, would not merely be tolerated, but also further expose Washington's fecklessness. There is a kernel of truth in the spin that some who want to downplay the Iranian attacks on Israel have been putting out since they failed to do any real damage or cause massive Israeli casualties. It's not true that Iran hoped that they would fail. Iran remains the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and as such aims to intimidate and kill its opponents, be they Israelis, Jews, Americans, Europeans, or Arabs. Iran's decision not to give the orders to their Lebanese henchmen to open fire on Israel, both after October 7th and now, is not a sign of goodwill or an attempt to de-escalate the conflict. Rather, it is more evidence that Tehran's leaders regard Hezbollah as their last recourse of defense against an Israeli or American attack on their country or nuclear facilities. The reasoning is if such an arsenal is used against Israel now, then they won't be able to employ it if and when the survival of their tyrannical regime is at stake. Equally obvious is that American calls for restraint have far more to do with Biden's political interest than U.S. security. The president is convinced that the main obstacle to his re-election this year stems from anger in the left wing of the Democratic Party about his initial support for Israel after October 7th. He believes that intersectional activists, as well as Arab American or Muslim voters, will abandon him if he doesn't prevent Israel from completing the job of destroying Hamas.
And I think that's what it's about. And also we see our own government here, the Conservative Party, is also concerned that they don't want to see an escalation in the Middle East because this is an important election year for them as well. So, but I think Biden is more concerned about the impact that his policies will have on the Democratic Party than acting in America's interests. I think he's forgotten to realize that America is the world's superpower, and you can have diplomacy, but diplomacy needs to be backed up by military force. Otherwise your words have no meaning or no credibility. And of course, the weakness of Biden's administration is why we're seeing the Iranian regime doing what it's doing, giving the green light to the October the 7th attack, because they don't fear any reprisal. And the closer the Iranian regime gets to acquiring nuclear weapons, the more dangerous the Middle East becomes, and the more dangerous Israel's situation and the West becomes. So it's almost imperative that Israel has no other choice but to send Tehran a strong message that if you attack us with over 300 rockets, missiles, drones, and cruise missiles, you'll face the consequences. And the only lesson, sadly, that the Iranian regime understands is that of military force.
Well,
it needs to be
Tobin
deployed.
here he concludes by saying that an American president who's truly serious about deterring an enemy and halting global terrorism would not be counseling restraint, which is what Biden is doing. He would be actively seeking to aid Israeli efforts to combat Iran and its allies, including supporting the eradication of Hamas. Biden should be ramping up sanctions on Tehran to force its economy to its knees, rather than continuing to try to seduce it with bribes like the $10 billion in frozen funds it recently freed up for them.
Absolutely, and we have to see that the Iranian regime is an absolute menace on the world scene. Not only do they suppress human rights in Iran, we've seen the horrendous abuse of freedoms within the regime itself, its persecution of Christians, how anti-Semitic this regime is, its desire to see Israel wiped off the face of the earth, its desire to see the destruction of the West, including the United States. So we know that the Iranian regime is not only a threat to Israel, but is a threat to the freedom of the world. So Reagan, over to you.
And the very next missiles and rockets could contain nuclear warheads, which is why we need to stay alert to what could be going on. But that's it for this evening's Behind the Headlines. Thank you so much, Simon, for an incisive program, and let's continue to pray into this situation as it develops. God bless you all.